The research ship shook hard as rocks from space hit its metal sides. Lee Tai-ho held tight to his seat as sparks flew from broken machines around him. The ship's computer voice spoke in calm words that did not match the danger they were in. Hull. Damage at 60%. Life support failing. Recommend immediate evacuation. Park Mira ran to the emergency pod bay, her hands moving fast over the controls. She was a scientist who studied alien life, but right now she needed to think like someone trying to stay alive. The ship groaned and twisted as more space rocks hit it. Tai-ho, get to the pod now, Mira called out. Tai-ho was an engineer who built things and fixed them. He grabbed his tool bag and Mira's research tablet from the floor where it had fallen. The tablet's screen was cracked, but still worked. Everything else was breaking or already broken. They jumped into the small escape pod just as a huge rock tore through the ship's main hull. The pod shot out into space like a bullet. Through the small window, they watched their ship break apart into burning pieces. "Where are we going?" Tai-ho asked as he strapped himself in. Mira looked at the pod's simple controls. The computer picked the closest planet. It has air we can breathe and water. That's all it knows. The planet below them was green and brown, with white clouds. It looked peaceful from space, but they were falling toward it much too fast. The pod's heat shield glowed red-hot as they entered the thick air around the planet. Trees rushed up to meet them. The pod crashed through branches and leaves, bouncing hard between thick tree trunks. Metal bent and glass broke. When everything finally stopped moving, Tai-ho's ears were ringing and his head hurt. Mira groaned and opened her eyes. Blood ran down her face from a cut on her forehead. "Are you alive?" she asked. "I think so," Tai-ho said. He tried to move and felt pain in his shoulder, but nothing seemed broken. "The pod?" They looked around at their small escape ship. The walls were bent inward and water dripped through cracks in the ceiling. The radio made only static noise. The emergency supplies had been thrown around and most were broken. The water containers had cracked and emptied. The food packages were crushed. "We need to get out," Mira said. "This thing could fall apart completely." Tai-ho pushed on the door until it opened with a loud screech. They climbed out into a forest unlike anything they had ever seen. The trees were huge, with silver bark that seemed to glow slightly. Strange sounds came from all around them, clicks and whistles and soft humming noises. The air smelled sweet and felt thick. 2 suns hung in the sky, one bright yellow and one smaller red one. Long shadows fell across the forest floor where odd plants grew in colors that seemed too bright to be real. "Look at this," Mira whispered. She knelt next to a plant with leaves that moved on their own, reaching toward her hand like they were curious about her. But Tai-ho was looking at something else. Between the trees he could see shapes moving. At first he thought they might be large animals, but then he realized they walked on 2 legs. They were watching the humans from a distance. "Mira," he said quietly, "we're not alone." She stood up, slowly, and followed his gaze. The creatures were about as tall as humans, but very different. They had hard shells that covered their backs, and many arms that ended in sharp points. Their eyes were large and dark, and they reflected light like mirrors. One of the creatures stepped closer. It made soft clicking sounds, and its shell changed colors, first blue, then green, then a warm orange. The other creatures stayed back, but their shells also began to change colors in waves and patterns. "They're trying to talk to us," Mira said with excitement in her voice. "The colors and patterns, it's like a language." The creature came even closer. It had no fear, only curiosity. It reached out one of its sharp arms toward Taiho, but stopped just before touching him. Then it made more clicking sounds, and its shell flashed bright yellow. "What do we do?" Taiho asked. Mira held up her hand, palm open, showing she meant no harm. The creature copied her movement with one of its arms. Then it pointed to itself and made a specific pattern of colors across its shell, blue to red to yellow. "I think that's its name," Mira said. She pointed to herself and said, "Mira," out loud. Then she pointed to Taiho and said, "Taiho." The creature tried to make sounds like their names, but with its different mouth, the words came out as strange, clicks and whistles. Still, it seemed to understand the idea. It pointed to each of them and made the clicking sounds that were probably its version of their names. More creatures emerged from behind trees. There were maybe 20 of them, all with the same hard shells and many arms, but each with different colored patterns. Some were smaller, probably children. They all watched the humans with those large, mirror-like eyes. The first creature, who seemed to be their leader, walked around the broken pod. It touched the metal with one arm tip, and its shell turned red with worry. It looked at the humans, and then at the sky, like it understood they had fallen from above. Night began to fall quickly. Both suns were setting, and the forest grew dark much faster than night fell on human worlds. In the distance, they could hear new sounds, deep roars and howls that made the shell creatures move closer together. The leader creature made urgent clicking sounds and gestured toward a direction deeper in the forest. Its shell showed rapid patterns of red and orange, colors that seemed to mean danger or warning. "I think they want us to come with them," Mira said. Taiho looked back at their destroyed pod. The radio was dead. The emergency beacon was broken. No one knew where they were, and even if a rescue ship came looking, it would take weeks or months to find this planet. "We don't have much choice," he said. They gathered what little they could carry from the pod. Mira's damaged tablet, Taiho's, small toolkit, and some pieces of metal and wire that might be useful later. Everything else was broken or too heavy to take. The shell creatures waited patiently as the humans got ready. When Taiho and Mira were ready to go, the leader started, walking into the forest. The other creatures surrounded the humans, not like guards, but like they were protecting them from something. As they walked through the dark forest, Taiho could hear more dangerous sounds in the distance. Whatever lived in this forest at night, even these shell creatures were afraid of it. He wondered what they had gotten themselves into, and whether they would live long enough to find out. The shell creatures led Taiho and Mira through the dark forest for what felt like hours. The humans stumbled over roots and rocks they could not see, but their guides moved easily through the darkness. The creatures' shells gave off a soft glow. That helped light the way, but it was not much light. Scary sounds followed them through the trees. Sometimes Taiho heard heavy footsteps not far away, and once something with many legs scurried across the path behind them. Each time the shell creatures would stop and make low warning clicks until the danger passed. Finally, they reached a cliff face with caves carved into the rock. The openings were natural, worn smooth by wind and water over many years. Warm light came from inside the caves. Not electric light, but the same soft glow that came from the creature's shells. The leader creature gestured for them to enter the main cave. Inside, Taiho and Mira found a whole community of the shell beings. There were maybe 100 of them sitting in groups around the cave. The walls were covered in glowing patches that gave off enough light to see by. "Bioluminescence," Mira whispered to Tejo. "They make their own light, like fireflies back on Earth." The creatures were all looking at the humans with curiosity. Some of the smaller ones, the children, came closer to touch Tejo's clothes with their arm tips. They seemed amazed by the fabric and the way it felt different from their own hard shells. An older creature approached them. This one was larger than the others, and its shell was covered in scars from old fights or accidents. When it moved, the other creatures showed respect by changing their shell colors to soft blue patterns. The old creature stood in front of Tejo and made a series of complex color patterns across its shell. The patterns were slow and careful, like someone speaking to foreigners who might not understand. "I think this is their elder or leader," Mira said. "Watch the patterns. Blue seems calm or peaceful. Red is warning or danger. Yellow might be curiosity or questions." Tejo nodded. He tried to copy some of the simple patterns he saw, using hand gestures since humans could not change colors. When he held up his hands and moved them in the same rhythm as the creature's color changes, several of the shell beings made excited clicking sounds. The first creature they had met, the one who found them by the crashed pod, came forward. It pointed to itself and made its personal color pattern again, blue to red to yellow. Then it made clicking sounds that might have been trying to say its name. "Clickthar," Mira said, trying to copy the sounds. "Is that your name? Clickthar?" The creature's shell flashed bright with what looked like happiness. It pointed to the elder and made different sounds with a pattern of green and gold colors. Quinsar, the elder seemed to be called. Over the next few hours, more creatures gathered around the humans. They brought food, strange fruits and nuts that tasted sweet and filling. The food was all raw, nothing cooked or prepared with heat. When Tejo pretended to eat something hot by blowing on it and fanning his mouth, the creatures looked confused. Mira took out her damaged tablet and managed to get it working. The screen flickered but showed her pictures of Earth and their space ship. The creatures gathered around to look at the images with amazement. When she showed them pictures of fire and electric lights, they backed away with their shells turning dark red. Clickthar made urgent clicking sounds and pointed at the tablet screen where a campfire photo was displayed. All the creatures in the cave began making worried noises and their shells flashed warning colors. "They're afraid of fire," Tejo realized. "Look how they react." Elder Quinsar came forward and touched the tablet screen gently. When the fire image did not hurt him, he seemed surprised. He made slow, careful color patterns that seemed to be questions. Mira tried to show them that the fire was just a picture, not real. She touched the screen to show it was flat and cold, but the creatures still seemed upset by the image of flames. Through more gestures and simple drawings in the dirt, the humans began to understand the creatures' way of life. They ate only raw food because they had never learned to make fire. They lived in caves because they could not build houses. They used only simple tools made from sticks and stones, and these tools were very crude. The creatures showed them around, their caves. There were sleeping areas where they curled up together for warmth. There were storage areas where they kept food and water, but everything was basic and primitive. They had never learned to make anything complex. As the night went on, Tejo noticed something important. The long darkness outside lasted much longer than nights on Earth or other human worlds. He counted the hours on Mira's tablet and realized the night period was about 18 hours long. That meant only 6 hours of daylight. During these long Nights, dangerous things hunted in the forest. The creatures explained through pictures and gestures that large predators came out when it was dark. These predators had many teeth and were very fast. The shell creatures could only hide in their caves and wait for morning. "No wonder they live like this," Taiho said to Mira. "They can only be active for 6 hours a day. The rest of the time they have to hide. And they can't make fire to keep predators away," Mira added, "or to cook food, or to work at night. They're stuck." Clickthar seemed to understand they were talking about something important. He led them to the cave entrance and pointed outside. In the distance, they could see glowing eyes moving between the trees. Something large growled, and all the shell creatures moved away from the cave opening. Through more careful communication, the humans learned that the shell creatures had lived this way for thousands of years. They had never thought to change their situation. The idea of making light or heat was like magic to them, impossible and frightening. But Taiho was already thinking like an engineer. He looked at the cave walls and the simple tools the creatures used. He thought about the 18-hour nights and the predators outside. Most importantly, he thought about what humans had that these creatures did not. "Mira," he said quietly, "what if we could teach them to make fire?" "They're terrified of it," she replied. "Did you see how they reacted to just a picture? But what if we could show them it's safe? What if we could prove that fire can help instead of hurt?" Mira looked around at the creatures huddled in their cave, hiding from the night. "It would change everything for them. But Taiho, we don't have any modern tools. No lighters, no matches, no metal. How could we even make fire ourselves?" Taiho smiled for the first time since the crash. "That's what humans do best. We figure out how to make something from nothing. We adapt." Outside the cave, something roared. Again closer this time. The shell creatures pressed together in fear, their shells turning dark colors. But Taiho was looking at the stone walls and thinking about physics and chemistry and all the ways humans had learned to make fire throughout history. The challenge was bigger than just surviving. These creatures had accepted their limitations for thousands of years. But humans never accepted limitations. They found ways around them. Tomorrow, when the short day began, Taiho would start showing them what was possible. When the two suns rose, the shell creatures became active again. They moved carefully to the cave entrance and looked outside before stepping into the light. The forest looked completely different during the day, peaceful and bright, with colorful birds flying between the trees. Taiho and Mira followed Clickthar and several other creatures as they went to gather food for the day. The humans watched how the creatures lived and worked during their short time in the light. Everything the shell creatures did was simple and basic. They picked fruits from low branches, using sticks to knock them down. They collected nuts that had fallen on the ground. They found roots by digging with their sharp arm tips, but only shallow roots because they had no real digging tools. When they found water, they drank directly from streams or collected it in hollowed-out gourds. They had no way to carry large amounts of water or to store it safely. Taiho noticed that the creatures looked nervously at the sky as the day went on. They were always watching the position of the suns, worried about how much daylight was left. "They live in constant fear," Mira observed. 6 hours of nervous activity, then 18 hours of hiding. As they walked back toward the caves, Clickthar found a fallen tree blocking their path. The tree was too big to climb over and too long to walk around easily. On Earth, humans would cut the tree or move it somehow, but the shell creatures just accepted it and started to take a much longer path through the forest. Tai-Ho stopped and looked at the tree. It was dead and starting to rot, which meant it was softer than living wood. He picked up a sharp rock and began hitting the tree trunk with it, trying to break off pieces. The shell creatures stopped and watched him with amazement. They had never seen anyone try to change their environment on purpose. They always worked around problems, never through them. After several minutes of hitting the tree with rocks, Tai-Ho managed to break off enough pieces to create a gap they could climb through. The creatures made excited clicking sounds, and their shells flashed bright colors of surprise and wonder. Clickthar picked up a rock and tried to copy what Tai-Ho had done. His first attempts were clumsy, but after Tai-Ho showed him how to hit at an angle and use the rock's sharp edge, Clickthar began to understand. When they returned to the caves, Clickthar immediately showed Elder Quinsar what he had learned. The old creature examined the pieces of wood and the rocks they had used. His shell showed patterns that seemed to mean deep thought and consideration. That evening, as the long night began again, Tai-Ho tried to talk to the creatures about making fire. He used sticks to draw pictures in the dirt and acted out striking rocks together to make sparks. The reaction was immediate and strong. All the creatures' shells turned bright red with alarm. They made loud warning clicks and backed away from Tai-Ho's drawings. Elder Quinsar stepped forward and used his arm tip to scrape away the pictures. Through careful gestures and color patterns, the creatures tried to explain their fear. They drew pictures of their own, images of destruction and burning forests. They showed Tai-Ho pictures of creatures running in terror from advancing flames. Flame spirits, Mira translated as she watched their communication attempts. That's what they call fire. They think it's some kind of evil spirit that destroys everything it touches. Clickthar joined the conversation, his shell showing colors of curiosity mixed with fear. He pointed to Tai-Ho, then to the erased fire drawings, then made questioning patterns with his colors. Elder Quinsar watched this exchange with interest. After a long moment, he began making slow, deliberate color patterns. The other creatures fell silent and watched him with respect. "I think he's making some kind of formal statement," Mira said. "Look how seriously they're all taking this." When the elder finished his color display, Clickthar translated using gestures and simple drawings. He drew a picture of Tai-Ho, then drew flames, then made an X over the flames. He pointed to the cave around them and made protective gestures. "He's saying we can't make fire here," Tai-Ho understood. "It's not allowed." But then Clickthar drew something else. He made a picture of the cave entrance, then drew the scary glowing eyes they had seen in the darkness. He showed creatures hiding in fear. Then he pointed to Tai-Ho and made questioning color patterns. Elder Quinsar saw what Clickthar was doing, and his shell showed displeasure, but other creatures began to join the conversation. Some of the younger ones made color patterns that seemed to support Clickthar's questions. The discussion went on for hours. Through careful observation, Tai-Ho and Mira began to understand what was happening. The creatures were debating whether the humans really could do what they claimed. Finally, Elder Quinsar stood up and made a long series of color patterns. All the other creatures fell silent and watched. When he finished, Clickthar translated for the humans. Using dirt drawings and gestures, Clickthar explained the elder's challenge. If Tai-Ho truly believed he could control the flame spirits, let him prove it. But he could not use the flame spirits themselves. That was too dangerous and forbidden. Instead, Tai-Ho must create light that would last through the long night and keep the predators away. He could use anything from the forest, but no flame spirits. If he could do this impossible thing, the creatures would know that humans really were as capable as they claimed. But if you fail, Clickthar's gestures seemed to say, you must admit that some things are impossible, even for humans. Tejo looked around at the expectant faces. More than half the creatures seemed to think the challenge was unfair. They had tried for thousands of years to make lasting light without flame spirits. Many generations of their smartest individuals had failed. They think it's impossible, Mira said quietly. To them, we're claiming we can do magic. It's not magic, Tejo replied. It's just engineering. He stood up and faced Elder Quinsar. Using the gestures he had learned, Tejo accepted the challenge. He would create lasting light without using flame spirits, and he would do it using only materials from the forest. The creature's shells flashed with amazement and worry. Even Clicthar seemed shocked that Tejo had accepted what they saw as an impossible task. Elder Quinsar made one final color pattern, and Clicthar translated it with obvious reluctance. The humans had 3 days to complete the challenge. 3 cycles of the long night to prove that the impossible could be done. If they failed, they would have to accept that they were not as special as they thought. They would have to live like the shell creatures lived, accepting the limitations of their world instead of trying to change it. Tejo nodded his agreement. 3 days to build a working lantern using only stones, plants, and human ingenuity. 3 days to prove that humans could adapt to anything. As the creatures settled down for the long night, Tejo was already planning. He thought about every method of making fire that humans had ever used. He thought about the materials available in this forest and the tools he might be able to make. Mira watched him think and saw the determination in his eyes. You really think you can do this? I don't think, Tejo said. I know. Humans have been making fire for hundreds of thousands of years. We've done it on ice planets and desert worlds and in space stations. We've done it with nothing but rocks and sticks and patience. He looked around at the sleeping creatures. Safe, in their cave, but trapped by their limitations. The only difference is that no one ever taught them how. The next morning, Tejo began his work, while Mira studied the forest around them. She used her scientific training to examine every plant and rock they might need, while Tejo started thinking like the engineer he was. Clicthar followed them everywhere, his shell showing colors of intense curiosity. Several other young creatures joined them, eager to see what the humans would try to do. Even some of the older creatures watched from a distance, though their shells showed colors of doubt. Tejo's first task was to make tools. The shell creatures had never thought to shape stones on purpose. They only used rocks as they found them. But humans had learned long ago that rocks could be changed to work better. He found 2 types of stone near the caves. One was hard and dark, probably some kind of volcanic rock. The other was softer and lighter colored, easier to break and shape. Tejo sat down with several pieces of each type and began the slow work of making tools. He struck the harder stone against the softer one, chipping away small pieces. The shell creatures gathered around to watch, their shells flickering with amazement as they saw Tejo deliberately breaking perfectly good rocks. What is he doing? Their color patterns seemed to ask each other. Why is he ruining the stones? But as Tejo worked, the purpose became clear. The random round rock became a tool with a sharp edge for cutting. Another stone became pointed for digging. A third became flat and smooth for scraping and smoothing other materials. Clicthar was the first to understand. He picked up stones of his own and tried to copy Tejo's movements. His first attempts broke the stones into useless pieces, but Taiho showed him how to control the angle and force of each strike. "Patience," Taiho said, even though he knew Clickthar could not understand the words. "Small taps, not big hits. Let the stone tell you where it wants to break." After several hours, Clickthar managed to make his first crude cutting tool. His shell blazed with colors of pride and excitement. He showed the tool to the other creatures, who examined it with wonder. Word spread through the caves. More creatures came to watch the stone-shaping process. Elder Quinsar arrived and observed silently as Taiho taught willing students how to make basic tools. By the end of the first day, Taiho had a collection of shaped stone tools and had taught a dozen creatures the basics of tool-making. But this was just the beginning of his plan. On the second day, Mira made her important discoveries about the forest plants. She found a tree with silver bark that produced thick, sticky sap when cut. The sap was clear and smelled sweet, but it became thick and gummy when exposed to air. "This could work as fuel," she told Taiho. "It's basically tree resin. Humans have used similar materials for lamps and torches throughout history." She also found plants with fibrous stems that could be twisted into rope or wicks. The fibers were strong and absorbed liquids well, perfect for drawing fuel up into a flame. But the most important discovery came when Taiho was testing his stone tools. He was using his sharp-cutting tool to scrape bark from a tree when he struck it against one of the harder stones by accident. A small spark jumped between the stones. "Did you see that?" he asked Mira excitedly. He struck the stones together again, deliberately this time. Another spark appeared, tiny but bright. The shell creatures who were watching jumped back in alarm, their shells flashing red warning colors. "Fire!" Clickthars. Color patterns seemed to shout. "Flame spirits!" But Taiho held up his hands calmly and showed that the spark was gone immediately. No flames appeared. No destruction followed. Just a tiny flash of light that disappeared harmlessly. He struck the stones together several more times, showing the creatures that the sparks were small and brief. Slowly, their alarm faded and curiosity returned. They crept closer to see the sparks more clearly. Mira examined the stones carefully with her scientist's eye. "The darker stone has mineral veins running through it," she observed, "probably iron or another metal. When you strike it hard enough with the other stone, it creates friction and tiny particles of hot metal." "Sparks," Taiho said simply. "Humans learned to make sparks thousands of years ago. The trick is catching them and feeding them until they grow." He spent the rest of the second day practicing with different combinations of stones. Some produced better sparks than others. Some were easier to strike repeatedly without breaking. By evening, he had found the best stones for spark making and had collected several sets. The creatures watched every step of this process with growing amazement. They had lived with these same stones for thousands of years, but had never discovered that sparks were hidden inside them. The idea that stones could hold light was like magic to them. On the third morning, the final day of the challenge, Taiho began building his lantern. He used his sharpest stone tool to carefully hollow out a piece of the softer rock, creating a shallow bowl with thick walls. The work was slow and required great patience. Each scrape of the tool removed only tiny amounts of stone, but gradually the bowl took shape. Clickthar and the other creatures watched in fascination as Taiho carved detailed grooves around the rim and smoothed the inside surface. While Taiho worked on the stone bowl, Mira prepared the other materials. She twisted plant fibers into a strong, wick and collected tree resin in smaller stone containers. She tested different combinations to see which worked best. "The resin burns well when it's fresh," she reported, "but it needs something to help it catch fire from just sparks. Maybe if we mix it with some dried grass or wood shavings." As the day progressed, more and more creatures gathered to watch. Even Elder Quinsar came to observe, though his shell showed colors of skepticism. To the shell creatures, what the humans were attempting seemed impossible. They had tried for generations to create lasting light. Their best efforts had been torches made from resin-soaked sticks, but these burned quickly and dangerously. The idea of controlled, long-lasting light was beyond their imagination. Late in the afternoon, Tai-Ho's stone lantern was ready. The bowl was smooth and even, with small channels carved to help air flow properly. Mira had prepared wicks of different thicknesses and had mixed the tree resin with tiny pieces of dried fibrous material to help it catch fire. As the suns began to set and the long night approached, the creatures gathered around the humans with excitement and nervousness. This was the moment of truth. Either Tai-Ho would succeed in doing the impossible, or the humans would have to admit that some challenges could not be overcome. Tai-Ho placed his wick in the stone bowl and poured the prepared resin mixture over it. The wick absorbed the fuel and stood ready. Now came the hardest part, creating enough sparks to light the wick and doing it in a way that would not terrify the watching creatures. He picked up his best spark-making stones and looked around at the expectant faces. Click-Thar's shell showed hopeful colors, but Elder Quinsar's patterns remained doubtful. "No pressure," Mira said quietly, trying to make a joke. Tai-Ho smiled and raised the stones. "Humans have been doing impossible things since we learned to walk upright. This is just one more." He struck the stones together and sparks flew toward the waiting wick. The first sparks fell onto the wick and died immediately. The shell creature's patterns showed they were not surprised. They had expected this failure. But Tai-Ho was not discouraged. He had expected this too. "The wick needs to be drier," he told Mira, "and the resin mixture needs more fibrous material to catch easier." He spent several minutes adjusting the fuel mixture, adding more dried grass and wood shavings. The creatures watched patiently as he made small changes and tested different combinations. This was how human engineering worked: try, learn, adjust, try again. On his fifth attempt, a spark caught in the dried material. A tiny glow appeared for a few seconds before dying out. The creature's shells flashed with excitement at this small progress, but Elder Quinsar remained unmoved. "Getting closer," Tai-Ho said. He adjusted the mixture again, making the fibrous material even finer so it would catch fire more easily. He also changed the shape of the wick, fraying the top to give the sparks more material to grab onto. The 10th attempt produced a small flame that lasted almost 30 seconds before going out. The creatures made excited clicking sounds, and their shells showed bright, hopeful colors. Even some of the doubtful older creatures moved closer to see. But Tai-Ho was not satisfied yet. The flame was too small and did not last long enough. For the lantern to work properly, the flame needed to be stable and steady, able to burn for hours without going out. He spent more time preparing the fuel mixture, getting the balance exactly, right between liquid resin and dry material. He also discovered that the wick worked better when it was twisted tighter, creating small channels that drew the fuel up more efficiently. As full darkness fell outside the cave, the dangerous night sounds began. Howls and roars echoed through the forest, and the shell creatures instinctively moved away from the cave entrance. This was the time when they normally huddled together in fear, waiting for the long night to pass. But tonight, they stayed near. The humans, watching the attempt to create impossible light. On the 15th attempt, Taiho's spark caught the prepared material perfectly. A small flame sprang to life and began to grow as it reached the resin-soaked wick. The creatures gasped and backed away in alarm as the flame grew brighter and stronger, but this time the flame did not go out. It settled into a steady burn, drawing fuel up through the wick and casting warm light around the cave. The stone bowl contained it safely, preventing it from spreading to anything else. The creatures stared in absolute amazement. They had never seen controlled fire before. Flame that obeyed rules and stayed where it was put. Their shells showed rapidly changing patterns of wonder, fear, and confusion. Clickthar was the first to approach the lantern cautiously. His shell showed nervous yellow patterns as he moved closer to examine the impossible sight. The flame danced gently in its stone container, giving off steady light and a small amount of heat. "It's not destroying anything," Mira observed. "Look how confused they are by that." Indeed, the creatures seemed shocked that the flame was not spreading or causing destruction. They had only known fire as a dangerous, uncontrollable force. The idea that it could be tamed and made useful was completely new to them. Elder Quinsar approached slowly, his shell showing deep colors of thought and consideration. He circled the lantern several times, examining it from every angle. The flame continued to burn steadily, proving that it was real and stable. Other creatures gradually moved closer as their fear faded. They could see that the flame stayed in its stone bowl and did not threaten them. Some of the braver ones reached out to feel the warmth it produced, marveling at this new sensation. "Watch this," Taiho said to Mira. He adjusted the wick carefully, making the flame smaller and dimmer. The creatures clicked with amazement as they saw the light change. Then he adjusted it the other way, making the flame brighter. The demonstration that the flame could be controlled was perhaps even more amazing to them than the fact that it existed at all. This was not a wild flame spirit that destroyed everything. This was a servant that did what the humans commanded. As the hours passed and the flame continued to burn steadily, the creatures' amazement grew into something approaching worship. They had witnessed the impossible made real. They had seen humans control forces that their people had considered myths and legends. But the true test came near midnight, when the hunting cries outside grew closer and more threatening. Through the cave entrance, they could see glowing eyes, moving in the darkness, the night predators that kept the shell creatures trapped in their caves. One of the predators, bolder than the others, appeared at the cave entrance. It was huge, with multiple rows of sharp teeth and eyes that reflected the lantern light. Normally, the shell creatures would have retreated to the deepest parts of the cave in terror. But something unexpected happened. The predator stopped at the cave entrance and would not come closer. It seemed confused and uncertain, unwilling to enter the space lit by the lantern flame. "It's afraid of the fire," Mira whispered. "Just like predators on Earth were afraid of human campfires." The predator circled the cave entrance several times, growling and testing, but it would not enter the lighted area. Finally, it gave up and disappeared back into the forest to hunt easier prey. The shell creatures had witnessed something that changed everything they knew about their world. The light that the humans had created did not just illuminate the darkness. It drove away the very dangers that had trapped them in caves for thousands of years. Clickthar made excited color patterns and clicking sounds, pointing from the lantern to the cave entrance where the predator had fled. Other creatures joined in, their shells flashing with realization and excitement. They understood now that the challenge had been about more than just making light. It was about changing the fundamental rules of their existence. For the first time in their species' history, they had a way to be active and safe during the long nights. Elder Quinsar stood before the lantern for a long time, his shell showing slow, thoughtful patterns. When he finally looked at Taiho and Mira, his colors had changed from skepticism to something like respect. Through gestures and simple drawings, he communicated his amazement. The humans had done more than meet the challenge. They had opened a door to possibilities that his people had never imagined. As the night continued, the lantern burned steadily. The flame never wavered or threatened to go out. It provided constant light and warmth, transforming the cave from a place of hiding into a place of safety and activity. Some of the younger creatures stayed awake all night, too excited by the new possibilities to sleep. They examined the lantern from every angle, trying to understand how it worked. They watched Taiho adjust the flame and add more fuel when needed. By morning, when the two suns rose again, the shell creatures had experienced their first night of true safety in generations. They had worked and talked and learned while the dangerous predators prowled helplessly outside their circle of light. The impossible had become possible. The humans had proven that limitations could be overcome with knowledge, patience, and ingenuity. But this was just the beginning. As Taiho looked around at the amazed faces surrounding him, he realized that the real challenge was not making one lantern. It was teaching an entire species how to change their world. Word of the humans' success spread quickly through the shell creature community. By the next evening, creatures from neighboring caves had traveled to see the impossible lantern for themselves. They arrived in small groups, their shells showing patterns of disbelief and wonder. Each new group went through the same progression of emotions. First, they reacted with alarm and fear when they saw the controlled flame. Then amazement as they realized it was not destroying anything. Finally, excitement as they understood what this meant for their lives. Elder Quinsar had called together the leaders from several cave communities for a formal demonstration. These older creatures were more set in their ways and harder to convince than the younger ones. Their shells showed deep skeptical patterns as they gathered around Taiho's lantern. "They want proof that it really works," Mira observed. "Not just that it makes light, but that it can actually protect them from the night hunters." Taiho understood the challenge. Making a flame was impressive, but proving that it could change their lives required a bigger demonstration. As darkness fell, he prepared for the most important test yet. The lantern had been burning successfully for 3 full nights now. Taiho had learned to adjust the fuel mixture and wick length to make it burn more efficiently. The flame was stronger and more stable than his first attempt. But tonight, instead of staying safely inside the cave, Taiho made a proposal that shocked everyone. Using gestures and drawings, he suggested that some of the braver creatures join him in venturing outside the cave while carrying the lantern. The reaction was immediate and intense. Every creature's shell flashed bright red with alarm. The idea of leaving the safety of the caves during the dangerous night was unthinkable to them. They had never done such a thing in all their history. Elder Quinsar made stern color patterns that clearly meant absolutely not. The other leaders agreed with rapid clicking sounds. The risk was too great, even with the magical flame light. But Clicthar stepped forward, his shell showing brave yellow patterns mixed with nervous blue ones. Through careful gestures, he indicated that he would go with Tai-Ho if the human was willing to try. "No," Mira said immediately. "It's too dangerous. We don't know how many predators are out there, or how they'll react to the light." Tai-Ho considered carefully. The demonstration would prove the lantern's power beyond any doubt, but the risk was real. If something went wrong, both he and Clickthar could be killed, and the shell creatures would never trust human ideas again. But sometimes, proving a concept required taking calculated risks. Humans had always been willing to test their innovations in dangerous situations. That willingness to risk failure was part of what made humans adaptable. "We'll stay close to the cave," Tai-Ho decided. "Just a few steps outside where we can get back quickly if needed. But we need to show them that the light really works as protection." He spent careful time preparing for the test. He made sure the lantern had plenty of fuel and that the flame was burning at its brightest and most stable. He also prepared backup lighting, bundles of resin-soaked material that could be lit quickly if the main lantern failed. Clickthar watched these preparations with growing nervousness, but also with determination. He seemed to understand that this moment would determine whether his people could break free from their limitations or remain trapped by fear. As full darkness settled over the forest, the dangerous sounds began as usual. Howls, roars, and the heavy footsteps of large predators moving through the trees. The shell creatures instinctively moved toward the back of the cave, following thousands of years of survival instinct. But Tai-Ho picked up the lantern and walked toward the cave entrance. Clickthar followed close behind, his shell showing rapidly changing patterns of fear and excitement. The other creatures watched in horror as the two figures stepped out into the deadly night. Some made urgent clicking sounds, trying to call them back to safety. Others simply stared in amazement at such unprecedented bravery. Outside the cave, the forest was alive with danger. Eyes glowed in the darkness between the trees, and threatening growls came from multiple directions. But as Tai-Ho held the lantern high, something remarkable happened. The predators stopped approaching. They could be heard moving in the darkness, circling at a distance, but none came close to the circle of light cast by the lantern. The flame created a barrier that they seemed unable or unwilling to cross. Tai-Ho and Clickthar stood in their pool of light for several long minutes, proving that the protection was real and reliable. They could hear predators all around them, but none attacked. The lantern was keeping them safe in the middle of the most dangerous environment their world had to offer. "It's working," Tai-Ho called back to the creatures watching from the cave entrance. "The light is keeping them away." To prove the point further, he moved the lantern in different directions, showing how the safe zone moved with the light. Wherever the flame illuminated, the predators would not go. The humans had not just created light, they had created portable safety. After 10 minutes outside, they returned to the cave to find every creature staring at them in absolute amazement. The demonstration had proven beyond doubt that the lantern could protect them from the night hunters. But the real impact came over the following hours. With the lantern providing safety, the shell creatures began to experiment with activities they had never tried during the long nights. Some began working on crafts and tools, using the light to see fine details that had been impossible in the dim glow of their bioluminescence. Others gathered to share stories and knowledge, staying awake and active instead of simply enduring the darkness. A few of the younger creatures even asked Tai-Ho to teach them how to make sparks with stones. They wanted to learn the human techniques for themselves, to understand how the impossible had been made possible. Most significantly, they began to plan activities that would require leaving the caves at night. They talked about gathering certain foods that were only available in darkness, or visiting distant relatives in other cave systems. The lantern had not just given them light, it had given them freedom. Elder Quinsar sat near the lantern for hours, his shell showing deep, thoughtful patterns. This old creature had spent his entire life accepting the limitations of the long nights. Now he was seeing possibilities he had never imagined. Through careful communication, he asked Taiho the question that was on every creature's mind. Could this technology be shared? Could other creatures learn to make their own lanterns? Taiho's answer was immediate and enthusiastic. Not only could the techniques be taught, but he was eager to share them. Humans had always believed that knowledge should spread, that innovations should benefit everyone possible. The idea of widespread lantern use excited the shell creatures tremendously. They began planning how to organize teaching sessions, how to gather the necessary materials, and how to spread the knowledge to distant communities. But they also had deeper questions. If humans could do this impossible thing, what other limitations might be overcome? What other aspects of their lives could be improved with human knowledge and techniques? As the night progressed, Taiho found himself surrounded by creatures eager to learn everything he could teach them. They wanted to know about tool-making, about controlling fire, about the human way of solving problems by changing the environment instead of accepting it. The lantern continued to burn steadily, casting its warm light over a community that was beginning to transform itself. The shell creatures were learning that they did not have to live in fear of the darkness. They did not have to accept the limitations that had defined their existence for thousands of years. By morning, when the two suns rose again, everything had changed. The creatures who had spent the night in the light of human innovation were different from those who had hidden in darkness the night before. They had learned the most important lesson humans could teach, that the impossible was often just the untried, waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it. The next few weeks brought changes that no one could have imagined. What had started as a simple survival necessity became a revolution in how the shell creatures lived and thought about their world. Taiho established teaching sessions during the short daylight hours. Groups of creatures gathered around him as he demonstrated the techniques for making stone tools, preparing fuel mixtures, and creating sparks. Each step was broken down into simple, repeatable actions that the creatures could learn and practice. Mira worked alongside him, using her scientific knowledge to identify the best plants and materials for lantern making. She created a system for testing different combinations of resin and fiber, finding ways to make the fuel burn longer and more cleanly. Klikthar became their first and best student. His natural curiosity and willingness to try new things made him an ideal learner. More importantly, he could translate human concepts into ideas that other shell creatures could understand. Show them the pattern, Klikthar would indicate with his color displays when other creatures struggled with a new technique. He had learned that human knowledge often followed logical patterns that could be taught step by step. The first group of students took several days to make their first successful lanterns. Their early attempts were crude and burned unevenly, but they worked. Each success brought excited clicking sounds and bright color patterns of achievement. But not everyone was enthusiastic about the changes. Elder Quinsar and some of the older creatures worried about moving too fast. They had spent their lives following careful, safe traditions. The idea of rapid change made them nervous. Through patient communication, these older creatures expressed their concerns. What if the flame spirits became angry at being controlled? What if the changes brought new dangers they had not considered? What if the old ways were forgotten and lost? Taeho understood their fears. Change was always frightening, especially for people who had lived in stable but limited ways for a long time. Humans had faced similar resistance throughout their history when introducing new technologies. "We don't have to abandon the old ways," he communicated through gestures and drawings. "We can add new possibilities while keeping the safety of tradition." To prove this point, he suggested, starting slowly. Only a few lanterns would be made at first, used just in the main caves, where many creatures could observe their effects. If problems arose, they could be stopped immediately. This compromise satisfied most of the concerned elders. They agreed to watch and learn, ready to support the new technology if it proved truly safe and beneficial. The real breakthrough came when the creatures began improving on human techniques. Taeho had taught them the basic principles, but their different anatomy and perspectives led them to innovations he had not considered. Their sharp arm tips, for example, were much better than human fingers for certain kinds of fine work. They could carve more precise channels in stone and create more efficient wicks from plant fibers. Some of their improvements made the lanterns burn brighter and last longer than Taeho's original design. "They're becoming engineers," Mira observed, with pride. "Not just copying what we show them, but understanding the principles and making them better." The creatures also began experimenting with different applications for their new fire technology. They discovered that certain foods tasted better when heated, leading to their first experiments with cooking. They found that heated stones could be used to warm sleeping areas during cold nights. Most surprisingly, they began using controlled fire for artistic purposes. The creatures had always created visual art through their color patterns, but fire opened new possibilities. They learned to create colored flames using different plant materials and to make permanent artwork by charring designs into wood and stone. These cultural changes happened faster than anyone expected. Within a month, the shell creatures had gone from fearing fire to embracing it as a central part of their lives. The long nights that had once been times of terror became opportunities for work, learning, and creativity. The transformation was not limited to technology. The creature's entire social structure began to change as well. Previously, the long nights had forced them into isolated family groups, huddled together for warmth and safety. Now they could gather in larger communities, sharing knowledge and working together on complex projects. Young creatures who had shown interest in learning human techniques became respected teachers themselves. Klikthar found himself leading groups of students, passing on not just the technical knowledge but the human approach to problem solving. "Think like humans," he would communicate through his color patterns. "When you see a problem, don't accept it. Find a way to change it." This mindset shift was perhaps the most important change of all. The shell creatures were learning to see their environment as something they could modify and improve, rather than something they had to simply endure. The success attracted attention from distant communities. Shell creatures traveled from faraway cave systems to see the miraculous lanterns for themselves. Many stayed to learn the techniques, then returned home to teach others. A network of knowledge began to spread across the continent. Communities that had been isolated for thousands of years were suddenly connected by shared innovations and ideas. The exchange of information accelerated the pace of change even further, but the most dramatic transformation was in the creatures' relationship with their environment. Armed with portable light and the ability to work safely at night, they began exploring areas of their world that had been too dangerous to visit before. They discovered new food sources, new materials for their crafts, and new territories where they could expand their communities. The lanterns had not just given them light. They had given them the ability to truly inhabit their world instead of merely surviving in it. Elder Quinsar, who had been the most skeptical about the changes, became one of their strongest supporters. His long experience and wisdom made him an excellent judge of which innovations were truly beneficial and which might cause problems. "The humans have given us more than fire," he communicated during a gathering of community leaders. "They have given us the knowledge that change is possible." As the weeks passed, Tai-Ho and Mira watched their accidental students become teachers and innovators in their own right. The shell creatures were no longer just learning human techniques. They were developing their own technologies based on human principles. The transformation was accelerating beyond what the humans had imagined possible. What had started as a simple demonstration of fire-making had become the foundation for a completely new way of life. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the creatures' confidence and ambition. They were no longer content to accept limitations. They were actively looking for new challenges to overcome, new improvements to make, new possibilities to explore. They had learned the most important lesson that humans could teach, that intelligence and determination could overcome almost any obstacle. The impossible was just another problem waiting for a solution. 3 months after the crash, the rescue signal finally came. Mira's damaged tablet detected the approach of a human search vessel, its engines cutting through the atmosphere of the unnamed planet. After so long with only the gentle sounds of the forest and the clicking conversations of the shell creatures, the mechanical noise seemed strange and foreign. The rescue ship landed in a clearing near the caves, its metal hull gleaming in the light of the two suns. Captain Kim Jin-ho emerged, with his crew, expecting to find 2 stranded survivors grateful for rescue. Instead, they found something that challenged everything they thought they knew about first contact protocols. The shell creatures had gathered to witness the arrival of more humans. But these were not the frightened, primitive beings that the rescue team had been briefed to expect. These creatures moved with confidence and purpose, carrying advanced tools and technologies that seemed impossible for their supposed level of development. "Tai-Ho? Mira?" Captain Kim called out, scanning the crowd of alien beings for his missing crew members. "We're here," Tai-Ho replied, stepping forward with Clickthar beside him. "But we're not exactly stranded anymore." The captain's eyes widened as he took in the scene around him. The shell creatures had built an entire workshop area outside their caves, with stone furnaces for better fire control, advanced tools laid out in organized rows, and lanterns providing light even in broad daylight. This was not the primitive society described in their files. "What happened here?" Captain Kim asked in amazement. Mira smiled and gestured toward the bustling community around them. "We learned that intelligence isn't limited to species that look like us. And they learned that limitations are often just assumptions waiting to be challenged." Clickthar approached the rescue team, his shell displaying patterns of formal greeting. In the months since first contact, he had learned to recognize human body language and emotional expressions. He could see the confusion and surprise on their faces. Through the communication system that had developed between humans and shell creatures, Clickthar welcomed the new arrivals and offered to show them around the community. The rescue team followed in stunned silence as they toured facilities that seemed to have advanced years beyond what should have been possible. The shell creatures had not just learned to make fire, they had mastered it completely. Their latest, lanterns burned with precise, controlled flames that could be adjusted for different purposes. They had developed cooking techniques that produced food more nutritious and flavorful than anything they had eaten in their history. More impressive were the innovations they had developed independently. They had learned to use controlled fire for metalworking, heating the mineral-rich stones until they could extract pure metals. Their latest tools were made from these refined materials, stronger and more precise than anything possible with raw stone. They did this in 3 months? One of the rescue crew asked in disbelief. Once they understood the principles, they improved on them faster than we could teach, Taiho explained. They're natural engineers. They just needed someone to show them that their environment could be changed instead of simply endured. But the most remarkable development was in their social and cultural evolution. The shell creatures had formed collaborative work groups that shared knowledge and resources across multiple cave communities. They had developed new forms of art and expression that incorporated their fire technology. They had even begun exploring philosophy and abstract thinking in ways their people had never attempted before. Elder Quinsar approached the rescue team with a special presentation. In the months since the Lantern breakthrough, he had become the keeper of their historical records and cultural innovations. His shell displayed the formal patterns reserved for the most important communications. Through Clickthar's translation, Elder Quinsar explained how the human presence had changed everything for his people. They had gone from accepting their limitations to actively seeking new challenges to overcome. They had learned that progress was possible, that their lives could be better than they had ever imagined. But more than that, they had learned to think like humans, to see problems as opportunities, obstacles as puzzles to solve, and impossibilities as simply ideas that no one had tried yet. The Elder produced a special gift for the rescue team. It was a lantern unlike any that Taiho and Mira had seen before. The shell creatures had spent weeks creating it, using their finest materials and most advanced techniques. The lantern was carved from a single piece of stone with intricate patterns that seemed to glow in the light. The metalwork was precise and beautiful, incorporating decorative elements alongside functional improvements. Most impressively, the fuel system had been redesigned to burn more efficiently and last longer than any previous version. This is their masterpiece, Mira explained as she examined the gift. They wanted to show what they could accomplish when they combined human principles with their own innovations and perspectives. Captain Kim accepted the lantern with appropriate ceremony, recognizing that he was receiving something far more significant than a simple craft object. This was proof that intelligence and creativity could flourish anywhere, given the right spark to ignite them. The rescue team spent several days documenting what they had found. The shell creatures demonstrated their technologies and shared their knowledge freely, eager to show what they had learned and accomplished. But perhaps the most important discovery was how the relationship between humans and shell creatures had evolved. These were no longer primitive beings receiving help from advanced visitors. They had become partners and equals, each contributing unique perspectives and abilities to their shared endeavors. When it came time for the humans to leave, the farewell was more complex than anyone had expected. Taiho and Mira had originally been stranded survivors, but they had become teachers, friends, and bridges between two very different species. Clicktharr and many others expressed their desire to continue learning and growing. They wanted to maintain contact with human civilization, not as dependent primitives seeking help, but as equals ready to contribute their own knowledge and perspectives to the larger community of intelligent species. "We will remember what you have taught us," Clicktharr communicated through his color patterns. "But more important, we will remember how you taught us to teach ourselves." As the rescue ship prepared for departure, Tai-Ho looked back at the thriving community that had grown around the caves. Lanterns glowed throughout the settlement, their light representing far more than simple illumination. They represented the triumph of curiosity over fear, innovation over tradition, and possibility over limitation. The shell creatures had learned the most fundamental lesson of human nature, that intelligence combined with determination could overcome virtually any challenge. They had discovered that they were not prisoners of their environment or their biology, but architects of their own destiny. Months later, when the rescue ship reached human space and filed its reports, the story of the shell creatures spread throughout the galaxy. It became a reminder that intelligence and potential existed in forms that humans might never expect, waiting only for the right circumstances to flourish. The planet was classified as a protected world, with careful protocols, established for future contact, but it was also recognized as home to a species that had proven its ability to innovate and grow at an extraordinary pace. In the years that followed, human visitors would find the shell creatures continuing to advance and develop. They had not just learned to make fire, they had learned to learn. They had become a species that embraced change and actively sought new challenges to overcome. The lanterns still burned in their communities, but they were no longer the most advanced technology the creatures possessed. Each generation built upon the knowledge of the previous one, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and in quiet moments, when the shell creatures gathered around their lights to share stories and knowledge, they would remember the two humans who had shown them that the impossible was just another word for the untried. The legacy was not just in the technology they had shared, but in the mindset they had demonstrated, that any limitation could be overcome with enough creativity, persistence, and willingness to try.